All right, Alexander, let's talk about the peace summit, the Saudi US Ukraine peace summit that was held in Jeddah that wrapped up
Yeah.
over the weekend in Saudi Arabia, and it's kind of a mixed bag of reporting, to be quite honest. Some Western mainstream media outlets are saying this was a huge success. Others are saying this was okay. It was a moderate success for Ukraine. Other outlets are saying that this was a big nothing burger, that nothing really came out of it. I think this was a complete failure. And actually, we have statements now from Zelensky and Podolyak, his top advisor, saying that whatever concessions Ukraine appeared to have made during this conference, forget about it. The only formula is Zelensky's peace. They call it the Zelensky formula, is what they call it. That's the only way forward for Ukraine. And I think this is a failure because there's one signal, there's one sign which points to this being a complete, absolute failure, and that is the fact that there was no consensus on a statement from the parties. They couldn't come up with one unanimous statement to conclude this summit. So, what was your thoughts
No, I
on
think
the Jeddah summit?
I am in complete agreement with you. I think it was a failure. In fact, I would go further. I would say it was a debacle, actually. Now, first of all, a number of things. In the run-up to this summit, it looked as if China and Brazil were going to stay away. China and Brazil, in the event, attended. And I think the Western powers would have been much more relieved and happy in some respects if China and Brazil had stayed away. Because what I suspect happened is that there were lots of phone calls between the various BRICS countries, between Brasilia and Beijing, and, dare I say, Moscow. And it was agreed that they would all go. Because what actually happened at this Jeddah summit is that the West, the United States, which had called this meeting in the first place, and of course Ukraine, lost control. They lost control of the agenda. It became absolutely clear that the global South countries, the BRICS countries, the Saudis, the Chinese, the Brazilians were not interested in the Zelensky formula. I mean, they were just, which is what this summit was originally supposed to have been convened to discuss. They said this is an absolute non-starter. We are not interested in that. Li Hui, who was the Chinese representative, remember he's supposed to be the Chinese mediator, who's supposed to be mediating or trying to mediate a solution of the conflict between China and between Russia and Ukraine. He said quite openly, there are disagreements between us about what is going on, and there has to be a more realistic approach taken. Saudi Arabia came forward with its own peace plan, which was not a peace plan which Zelensky, whatever he calls himself, would have been happy with at all, or indeed Jake Sullivan either. And the Brazilians said, well, look, we've come along this time, but we don't think any more of these meetings should happen without the Russians. And it seems that to the extent that other global South countries participated, that was their general view. And perhaps not coincidentally, there's been a rather sniffy piece that's appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Covers various topics, but it says one interesting thing, which is that the fact that Ukraine's offensive is not succeeding has made the Biden administration cool to the entire idea of talks at all, because Ukraine and the United States are not in the position of strength which they wanted to be in order for talks to happen. Now that, to my mind, simply confirms the point that you were making, several videos ago, which is that the whole point about having this meeting in Jeddah was that there was going to be a Ukrainian breakthrough in the battlefronts, and then you'd go to Jeddah and you'd present the Zelensky peace formula, as I'm going to call it, as the way forward and get everybody to rally round it. When it became clear in Jeddah that that wasn't going to happen, the Americans have walked off with a sulk, and they're now telling their friends in the media, well, in all the circumstances, we don't think that this is a good time for talks at all.
Yeah, what do you make of Podoliak's statement and Zelensky's statement, which is, essentially whatever we discussed in Jeddah, forget about it, because
Yeah.
there's going to be no peace negotiations. There's going to be no ceasefire, none of that stuff. How do the countries that attended this peace summit look at the Ukraine government after that statement? 24 hours after the summit wrapped
Yeah.
up, you get the statement from Podolyak and Zelensky. And why do you think the Ukraine government came out with a statement like this 24 hours after the summit wrapped up,
Well, the
essentially
reason
wiping away everything that was discussed at the summit?
the reason it happened is not difficult at all to work out. What happened clearly was that Ukraine, and of course the Western powers, came under very heavy pressure from the Saudis, the Brazilians, the Chinese, the Indians, all of them. They piled in, and they said the Zelensky formula is a hopeless idea. It simply won't fly. And the Saudis then came along with their plan, which basically asks Ukraine to cede eastern Ukraine to Russia. There are other aspects to it, but that's what it amounts to. And I think that what happened was that Yermak, who is another of Zelensky's advisors, who was the representative there, I think he was very anxious to get agreement for another meeting, because it's important for the Ukrainians and for the West to show that this process is rolling along. So he probably said, well, we're prepared to discuss these Saudi ideas. And of course, when Yermak got back to Kiev, that wasn't acceptable. So that needed a statement from Podolyak to say, well, whatever Yermak might have said in Jeddah, this isn't what we're prepared to do at all. We stand firm on our hardline position, which remains as hardline as ever. And in fact, we're getting all kinds of extraordinary statements now from Ukraine. I mean, Zelensky is now writing on his Telegram channel about general mobilization. He's saying that Ukraine can't rely on its friends to the extent that it did. He's also talking about a diplomatic initiative. You covered this very well in one of your videos, by the way, on your channel. A diplomatic initiative to try to win over the global south, which looks like being independent of the Jeddah process. So Ukraine is trying to reassert its hard line in light of not exactly concessions, but a sort of retreat under pressure that Yermak made in Jeddah. And that's the story. And of course, in this, they are being supported by their neocon friends in Washington, who are now busy telling the Wall Street Journal that actually negotiations at the moment are really not a good idea, because instead of being in a position of strength, we find ourselves in a position of weakness instead. So you can see that there's actually been a hardening of the positions. And what Jeddah has done is it's actually made the Ukrainians and the Americans, or at least the neocons in the US, less willing to even consider negotiations.
Unbelievable. What do you make of Zelensky's statement where he said that he's going to sink the Russian Navy, the Russian fleet, if they continue to assert their dominance of the Black Sea? I mean, you're talking about hardening your position. Here you have Zelensky now talking about some sort of naval conflict with what Navy, obviously with drones, that he's going to use to try and attack the Russian ships that are in the Black Sea. But these are going to be drones and weapons supplied by the collective West, most notably, I imagine, the UK, along with US coordination. So, what do you make of this statement from Zelensky?
Well, I think on the one level, it's an absolutely melodramatic statement that Zelensky likes to make, and it's also, I think, partly intended to put pressure on the Russians to go back into the grain deal, and there's going to be a pile up of pressure on that as well over the next couple of days. We'll discuss that perhaps in a different video. But anyway, so I think it's partly that, but I think it's also something that should be taken seriously. Ukraine is now hunting for more long-range missiles. So it's got these drones, which, by the way, have been almost entirely ineffectual. I think that's the thing we need to understand about these drones. The Ukrainians have launched them against various Russian warships. They managed to do minor damage to one, even though these seaborne drones, even though they've been launching them at Russian ships for months now. But I mean, they did a small amount of damage to a landing ship, but not enough to sink it. And they did a small amount of damage to a tanker, but again, not enough to sink it. The drones are not the real danger. The greater danger is that Ukraine might be supplied with long-range cruise missiles by Britain, France, and conceivably Germany, and that they might try to launch missile strikes on Russian warships in the Black Sea. Now, whether that will happen or not, I'm not saying, but I think that this is not just a bluff from Zelensky. It's partly what he's trying to do. He's trying to force the Russians back into the grain deal, but he's also, I think, trying to win victories in the Black Sea, given that his offensive elsewhere is at a complete stop. And it's the kind of thing, I have to say this, where I think the British, the French, and even the Germans, and perhaps even the Americans, well, in fact, definitely the Americans, might try and help him.
Well, I think they are helping him, and they
Yes.
definitely
Yeah.
will help
Yes.
him.
Yes.
Of course, they're going to say these are groups which are not affiliated with their militaries. These are mercenaries or contractors or stuff like that. But there's no doubt that the collective West is going to see this as an opportunity to as Lloyd Austin once said, to give Russia a bloody nose, which
Yes.
is basically what NATO
Yes.
is now focused on. I think there's a general consensus now throughout the collective West that this war is lost, and they're now just going to fight it in order to weaken Russia, or perhaps hope for some sort of Hail Mary incident that results in some sort of regime change. But I think there is now a clear understanding, or there's beginning to be a clear understanding, that the counteroffensive has failed. The conflict is unwinnable, and so now what do? You try to extend the conflict out, you try to damage Russia as much as possible, and you hope that, if you're the collective West, you hope that something happens
Yes.
that can lead to some sort of outcome that is beneficial to you. That's I
Absolutely.
think their position now.
Absolutely. I mean, I should say that, I'm already reading articles of the British media about how this is, a clever idea by Ukraine to launch attacks on Russian shipping in the Black Sea, because supposedly the Black Sea is so important for Russia's overseas trade that it will damage the Russian economy if they can't send their ships through the Black Sea. All of this is wildly exaggerated, by the way, but I can see how those arguments could be made. And, that will put pressure on the Russians, and it might, who knows, even trigger regime change there. And of course, if they could hit a Russian warship, like they say they hit the Moskva, you remember back in May last year, then of course, it's a big feather in their cap. The only thing I would say about hitting a Russian warship is that, of course, the Moskva was a very old warship from the 1980s, very run down. We don't quite know what happened, but even if it was Ukrainian missiles that got through, it's not up to the level of sophistication of the other remaining ships in the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which has been reinforced, by the way, since then. So launching a missile offensive against the ships of the Black Sea might not be particularly easy. That might be very difficult indeed. And bear in mind that Russia also has a strong submarine force in the Black Sea as well, which is basically invulnerable to anything Ukraine can do. So what Zelensky and the Western media are talking about can only have limited effect, and in terms of disrupting Russia's overseas trade, well, historically there have been ways of protecting civilian shipping. You can create convoys, you can do all kinds of things. And a lot of Russia's shipping anyway doesn't go through the Black Sea anymore. Once upon a time it did. In the 19th century, Odessa was Russia's biggest port, the third biggest city of the Russian Empire, but that's not the case any longer.
I have a final question. We had the other day Zelensky in this big media PR stunt. He accepted the delivery of French Scalp long-range missiles, which is pretty much Storm Shadow.
Yeah.
From what I understand, it's pretty much the
Yeah.
same thing. But he did this signing of the fighter jet. He got into the cockpit of the jet, and it was this big media production to signal that Ukraine is now getting these French Scalp missiles. You have reports of the UK Storm Shadow missiles being used to hit the two bridges in Crimea. What methods do you think Russia is going to employ in order to retaliate against the UK and against France? I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking about the UK and France, because it seems like the UK and France, when it comes to Europe, at least on a military level, if there's two countries that are really pushing the escalation, especially to hit Russian territory, which I think is key, especially to target Russian civilian infrastructure, Crimea and Moscow, it seems to be France and UK that are leading the charge. I just have a feeling that Russia's not going to leave this unanswered. I don't know
No.
how or when or in what way they're going to retaliate against the UK or France, but I don't think that Russia's just going to accept this from
No, I agree.
from France or from the UK.
I agree. I think the Russians up to this point have been basically responding with defensive things. And, we should be clear about the Storm Shadows. I mean, to all intents and purposes, they failed. And they were massively talked up as missiles that, it was going to be another game-changing weapon. I mean, we've heard so many game-changing weapons, but, it's a sophisticated missile. It's subsonic, but very fast subsonic. It flies low. It was said to be very, very difficult to intercept. Well, the Russians are shooting them down in large numbers. And apparently, talked about that attack on those two bridges. Well, the Russians claimed that there were 12 missiles launched in a single volley, that they shot down 9 and managed to jam and bring down a 10th, and only 2 got through. And the damage to the bridges is pretty superficial. We've seen pictures of that, so we can confirm it. So, they've not been particularly effective. But having said that, the British and the French are nonetheless escalating. I mean, the French are now sending Scalp missiles, and the British are clearly very involved in the Black Sea activities. I think what the Russians will do, I think you're right. I think that their patience with the British and the French is increasingly exhausted. I think what they will do initially is that they will start to hunt down British and French military people in Ukraine. I think that's the first escalatory step they will do. They know where these people are, and they will now start to search them out and hunt them down. This sort of decision-making centres. We've seen attacks on some of these decision-making centres already. There was a big attack, missile attack, a Russian missile attack on a hotel and restaurant. I think it was either in Pokrovsk or Kramatorsk. One loses track of things. But we hear that this is a hotel which foreign correspondents stay in, which suggests to me that it isn't just foreign correspondents. Remember, foreign correspondents, you can use that expression to cover all kinds of things. I mean, it's fairly well known that you can. And I think that the Russians will start hunting down, as I said, the British and the French in Ukraine itself. Conceivably, if this thing escalates even further, then you could see even more aggressive Russian escalations in other places, shooting down British aircraft and drones over the Black Sea. They do operate. The British do operate aircraft over the Black Sea. I think this is quite possible.
Okay. We will leave it there. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, and Telegram, as well as Rockfin. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.